Lecture 8, Robert Lowell's Skunk Hour and Elizabeth Bishop's The Armadillo, a postmodern dialogue on poetry, history, and truth.
Poetic tradition, ladies and gentlemen, is historical. Successor poets received a definition of the poetic task from their predecessors. The poets of the 20th century, particularly those who were born in such a way that they received modernism as an account of the task which, as poets, they must perform, were set particularly hard forms of the poetic problem by Yeats and the great moderns, for whom he invented the modernist style. Elizabeth Bishop was born in 1911 and died in 1979. Robert Lowell was born in 1917 and died in 1977. They were friends. The two poems which are our concern are Bishop's poem called Armadillo and Lowell's Skunk Hour. These two poems constitute an exchange, and among the subjects which these two writers, and most particularly these two poems, present to mind is both the individual poems to which I have just now made reference and the identity constructed in the relationship between these two poems, constituting the one for the other a relationship of successor and predecessor, which in some sense cancels the enigma of the modern inheritance. Bishop's poem, Armadillo, was the first written. Lowell's poem came after. Both were written in the second half of the decade of the 50s, no later than 1957. A large part of the study of poetry consists simply in the classification of new poems as they come to mind in such a way as to exhibit the affinity of the new or latest known to some discriminable lineage within the whole set of poems handed down from the past, the general tradition. In order to make such a sorting or classification of poems, it is necessary to construct sorting categories which index structural features, vocal qualities, judgments with respect to value and possibility, and so forth. Such sorting categories are necessary to facilitate the perception of the categorizable, but of course also make possible the detection of the uncategorizable, the new thing that is at the edge of the intelligible, knowable only because there is such an edge. For example, the poems we have studied together in this series of lectures, now coming to an end, seem to fall into two categories which will be helpful in understanding the bearing of the poem by Bishop, The Armadillo, and the poem by Lowell, Skunk Hour. Bishop's poem belongs in a category or class of poems which includes also The Children's Game, London Bridge is Falling Down, The Ballad of Tradition, Sir Patrick Spens, Emily Dickinson's 640, and would be found to include, if we were to study them, poems of George Herbert, of Wordsworth, Ashbery, and the like. This category or class of poems I will characterize as the matrix class of poems, and I will explain this term and make it useful in a moment. By contrast, Lowell's poem, The Skunk Hour, which we are about to read, belongs to a class of poems which include Shakespeare's Phoenix and the Turtle. In some respects, our poem by Keats, which in fact belongs to both of our classes, the Ode to the Nightingale, and Milton's sonnet, Avenge, O Lord. The class of poems to which Lowell's poem belongs would be found to include, if we were to study them, poems by Shelley, Blake, Hopkins, Ginsberg, and the like. These poems I will classify as poems defined as a class by their idealism of pattern. I am therefore making two sorting classes, the matrix sorting class and the pattern sorting class. And I'll explain the utility of these classes, whether named in this way or named in another way. I will also note that differences on which Lowell and Bishop established their separate accounts of the world are of the kind which in our earlier poems we have found to be incorporated within the poetic texts as an articulation of the whole problem of representation, by which I mean to say that the separation of pattern and matrix, the separation of the ideologies which govern, as I will show, the poems of these two friends, is a separation which in some sense is a function of the postmodern situation of these two writers, for the vectors and assertions that we find distinguished and partialized among these two poems have been found by us within the larger precincts of the poems that we have already studied, as if there were in effect an analysis of poetic possibility going on now, not within poems, but between practitioners, leading to a fragmentation which I think is fundamental to our understanding of poetry at the present time. In effect, our postmodern poets have specialized their practice as if the domain of possibility in which they worked were narrowed to a single chance. I shall first discuss the pattern and matrix categories in a preliminary way in order to bring to mind and organize some of the matter of the preceding 7 lectures. I shall then discuss Lowell's poem and after that Bishop's. The word pattern has inside it the father, the pater, and the patriarchal imagination of an ordered whole, abstract, prior to experience, constructed by reason of a rationality implying a center and a fixed measure by reference to a center. The founding story of the idealism of pattern is the Orpheus story, the founding story of that song which orders experience by reason of its relation not to personal memory, experience as we understand it, but to the great memory which has power over experience by being other to it, a pattern. The word matrix has inside it the mother, obviously, the mater. The founding story of the matrix idealism is the story of Philomela. The mind rises to the pattern. The poetry of pattern is the poetry of form, often accompanied by an ideology of the necessity or the inevitability of order in the social world and mind, but often accompanied also by a thematic or subject matter implying the threat of social disorder and personal madness. In the poetry of pattern, as in Lowell's poetry, the mind dominates the world or suffers the failure of domination. And that failure is registered as insanity. By contrast, the mind sinks into the matrix, or the matrix opens to receive and contribute life to the mind, as in Whitman. The poetry of the pattern is the poetry that says I, as Yeats says I, whose speaker cannot perceive the person without the pattern, the beloved without the Lydian type. The poetry of pattern cannot distinguish the dancer from the dance because it assigns to the pattern, the dance, the self-begotten presences. No history assigns to source, no origin outside itself. It is the poetry of the phoenix, this poetry of the pattern. The loss of pattern leads to avenging rage, as in Milton's Avenge, O Lord, or madness, as in Lowell's Skunk Hour, the poem before us, or in Ginsberg's Howl. the rage at the loss of pattern suffered by the mind, dependent on pattern for the intelligibility of experience and the representation of the person, is one of the most prominent and dangerous facts of the postmodern world, the world in which I live with you. The poetry of the Matrix, by contrast, is often a descriptive poetry, as is the case of the poetry of Elizabeth Bishop or the poetry of William Wordsworth. The poetry of the Matrix comes to rest in the realization of the particular and is accompanied by an ideology of description which posits that there is a real world prior to any thought which we may have of it, prior to any pattern, a real world to which the mind is obligated in the interests of health and safety to conform its attention. The world of pattern posits mind prior to world. The world of matrix posits world prior to mind. And in these two orderings of the relation of mind and world lie the characteristics which sort and order the tradition in very large measure. The poetry of Matrix is often the open form of free poetry, the poetry of what Whitman called free sense. Pattern poetry is the poetry of the mind alone. Phoenix poetry, Matrix poetry is the poetry of the turtle. The friendship of Lowell and Bishop, friendship and not marriage, resumes the history of the phoenix and the turtle and qualifies it, keeps it inside history as a consequence of Bishop's Dickinsonian capacity, I cannot live with you, to maintain difference, so we must meet apart. When all has been said, and I will say all, the two poems which we are studying are in fact a single text and should be present to mind as the trace of a relationship which contributed to each of two friends additional powers toward the representation of his or her particular pain. Each of the two poems before us is divided precisely in half. The first half of each poem situates the speaker in time, but as we shall see, each of these two poems understands time in quite different ways. Now note, concretely, by viewing your text, the first 4 stanzas of Lowell's poem of 8 stanzas represents time as the narrative history of decline from pattern. And the first line of his 5th stanza, the beginning of the second half of his poem, specifies that within the general narrative, and driven to speak because of the implications of the general narrative, his particular story begins, one dark night. By contrast, the first half of Elizabeth Bishop's poem, the first 5 stanzas of her poem of 10 stanzas, each breaks right in the middle, describes time not as Lowell does, as linear and producing a declension or increasing distance from source, but rather the first 5 stanzas of Bishop's poem describes time as cyclical, the time of the annually recurrent festivals of the church. The Feast of St. John seems to be the occasion of the poem, or the annually recurrent seasons. This cyclical Elizabeth Bishop time does not, by its nature, admit in itself of change, for the cycle is the ever recurrence of the same. It is as time inherently not narrative, though narratives arise in it by a crossing or interruption of its processes. For example, the shift of wind in stanza 5. The second half of Bishop's poem begins, the first line of stanza 6 begins, last night another big one fell, as the second half of Lowell's poem begins, one dark night. Each of the two poems, therefore, begin with a description of the world in accord with two very different accounts of time. Lowell's pattern time projects history as a linear descent from a primordial or archetypal pattern, and the decline and decay of history is registered as distance from that pattern, which is registered in character as insanity or the pain of the loss of the beloved object. The poem which we study of Bishop begins in cyclical time, and there is no way in that time of being more or less distant from source. It maintains a regulated relationship to the reality it describes, and the state of mind of the speaker is capable of affirming the subject self in the form of a will which protests not the madness of the self, but the unregulated character of a social world to which the will, thus realized of the self, may address itself. In the case of Lowell's poem, the narrative of the self is a disastrous continuation of the narrative of history as a whole, whereas, as I have observed, in Bishop, the account of non-recurrent event, the accident which is her subject, is a singularity within a fundamentally non-narrative temporal system. In Lowell's reality, all personal narrative, each poem is the continuation of the story of the loss of pattern and part of the general narrative of civilizational decline. In Bishop's reality, all particular narratives, each poem results from a slight differentiation within the otherwise seamless fabric of a continuous matrix. The work of knowing and representing the person is performed, in Bishop's case, by attention to such slight differentiations. Here now I will read to you the first 4 stanzas of Lowell's poem Skunk Hour. They give an account of the failure of pattern in history, which results in the loss of the abstract or transcendental means by which the person secures an account of being at all. I observed at the beginning of these lectures that poetry becomes an act of the will at the point of the exhaustion of all other means by which to represent and thus communicate the presence of a person. The crisis which drives Lowell's poem into actuality is the cry at the end of the 6th stanza, a cry from an abyss of darkness and of the unrepresentability of the self, deeper than any we have before heard. Nobody's here. The first 4 stanzas of the poem give an account of the history of that disappearance of the self. Here are the 4 stanzas. Here is the text. Nautilus Island's hermit, Eris, still lives through winter in her Spartan cottage. Her sheep still graze above the sea. Her son's a bishop. Her farmer is first selectman in our village. She's in her dotage. Thirsting for the hierarchical privacy of Queen Victoria's century, she buys up all the eyesores facing her shore and lets them fall. The season's ill. We've lost our summer millionaire who seemed to leap from an L.L. Bean catalog. His 9-knot yawl was auctioned off to lobstermen, and red fox stain covers Blue Hill. And now our fairy decorator brightens his shop for fall. His fishnets filled with orange cork, orange his cobbler's bench and all. There is no money in his work. He'd rather marry. Now you will recognize the appeal to pattern or type for the maintenance of the world as representable. Nautilus Island, Spartan College, Cottage, Queen Victoria's Century, L.L. Bean Catalog, like Lydian Body, Tudor Ford, like Lydian Body, right? This is a world in which brand names substitute for the mythic substantiation of the self. No wonder they don't work very well, and that includes Trinitarian Church. Like Yeats' Lydian Body or Quattrocento Figure, these predications devised to maintain presence derived from a clearly failing Gentile world establishment announce their failure and the decline both of the world and the word. In Yeats, however, such predications, such applications of pattern enforce the sense of difference between the self-born archetype and the actual world. In Lowell, by contrast, the actuality fails because the archetype is trivial and empty. In Yeats, there is a demonic vitality to the inaccessible powers which he can bring to mind but not connect with the real. In Lowell, the pattern itself is drained of its vital life and can, even if predicated upon a reality which receives it, contribute no vitality.
This is the end of Side A. Please fast forward the cassette and turn it over to continue.